This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Go to the link in the description below so they know that I sent you.
Limited recall.
No, I am not making this up as I go.
Hello everyone, this is Nietzahone. Welcome to my brand new podcast, Limited Recall, with Mike from Mythic Tales, where we're going to combine our interests of draft and Magic's history to take a bit of a deeper dive than we normally would in my regular videos.
I've been bugging Nietzahone for a long time to do a podcast, and we finally got there. We know there are plenty of other podcasts discussing Limited, so thanks for checking this one out. Why don't we give them the sales pitch on what makes this one a little bit different?
Well, the first half isn't going to be a whole lot different than your standard Limited podcast. Mike and I will discuss the latest strategy, archetypes, and cards we're enjoying from the latest draft set, and occasionally talk about some broader strategy about Limited in general. The second half of the show will be a bit different. Each episode, I'll be preparing a piece of Magic history to retell to Mike, who hopefully won't know too much about it, and we'll have some fun with it, and hopefully learn a thing or two about Magic's past, or at the very least, see how the events may have informed things that are happening now.
I look forward to your book report, Professor Nietzahone. It's actually very fitting because if you weren't aware, Nietzahone is legitimately a professor of history. It just seemed like a natural fit.
Yeah, I do actually have a PhD in history, though it's in medieval European history, which is a little bit distant, from Magic. I don't know if anyone actually has a PhD in the history of Magic at this point, but yeah, I am very interested in this game's history, so I think it's a interesting thing for us to talk about.
I think it's pretty cool.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's not uncommon that I tell people what I study, and their immediate question is, do you watch Game of Thrones? Which, I mean, I do.
Yeah.
But the fact, or the other common one, do you go to Renaissance fairs? But I don't know, people, there you go. But yeah, I do like Game of Thrones, and I do like Magic, which is set in a fantasy realm, which for a lot of reasons is always sort of a medieval world. So I guess it kind of works out.
I may not be a historian, but growing up, I loved medieval everything. Like, medieval times was my favorite place to go for birthdays. I think I only did that twice, but still, I used to draw castles and knights in armor and stuff. I think that's actually what kind of sparked my interest in art, if I'm totally honest. So, there was this old public access cable channel, at least in upstate New York, called Pappy Drew It. He was basically like low rent Bob Ross.
Nice.
Where he'd show you how to paint a nice tree or something, and I had my little Fisher Price Lego Knight castle, and I drew that with a dragon on top of it, and then I sent it into the show, and it got shown on the show, and I remember I was so excited, and that definitely helped me be confident in doing art. And then went back and forth on it, and eventually I got to the point where I don't draw anymore, but I at least animate things. So
yeah, and on a related note, if you don't know Mike, you already sort of do if you watch my YouTube videos, because he did the cool River Hoopo animation. He taught me how to use things like Photoshop and Premiere so that my videos aren't made in PowerPoint anymore. If you saw the last preview card I had of Ashiok, he did all that cool animation. So you already sort of know Mike's work if you don't know him.
Decisions.
Challenge accepted.
All right, so, now that you know who we are, one of the things we mentioned is that we both really love Limited, especially Draft. And we mentioned one of the key things on this podcast is going to be to talk about the latest Limited format. If you know me, I make a lot of Limited content, multiple draft videos a week. I stream Limited. So I love talking about it and I love playing it. And on this podcast, we're going to talk about Limited a lot. And right now, of course, the format that's out, the newest format is War of the Spark. So that's what we're going to start talking about.
Yep, and I'm not a Limited expert by any means, but it's probably my favorite format. I do like Standard because I like customizing decks and I like brewing, but part of that is brewing is kind of great in Draft because you get to make a new deck every time. I am just hooked on, if I'm totally honest with myself, I think I just like the card picking section more than anything else, the actual draft. Because by the 7th game playing it, especially on Arena, you just kind of feel like, okay, I'm ready for the next one. But either way, I'm always really excited to fire up Draft, and so far it's also been my best ranked thing on Arena. I've gotten to Diamond 2 so far in Draft. Not consistently, not every season, but it's definitely been my peak. Just been a little too busy for it, but I'm hoping someday we'll hit Mythic. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't hit Mythic yet either because the way Arena does things, the fact that you can't always play, for example, where the Spark ranked, but that's probably a separate topic for a different podcast for a different day.
Definitely.
But yeah, I haven't hit Mythic yet either. So yeah, I mean, hopefully maybe one of my goals with this podcast will be to firmly convert you from saying it's probably your favorite format to just your favorite format. Maybe we can get there with this podcast.
Oh, I won't take too much convincing. Standard is just a mess, but again, different. We can go over Standard like once Limited has felt a little played out. I'll try to give everybody a primer on that too. So if you're interested, we'll give you a warning if you're only a limited person, if we do end up doing a constructed podcast. But hey, let us know in comments or tweet at us if you do want us to talk about anything else.
All right, so let's dive into talking about War of the Spark. Mike, what are your first impressions of War of the Spark? I guess a good question, too, is how much have you drafted the set so far, or play sealed or whatever?
I love Planeswalkers, and I hate Planeswalkers at the same time. For me, like, the hardest part about this format is just discipline. Like, it is, just aggravating, like, especially when you open just one of the 2-color Planeswalkers in a later pack. And sometimes the bots on Arena will even give them to you like second or third pick. It's just so tempting to just click that and add it to the pile because you're like, I know I can make this work, but I don't know about you, but the fixing is definitely a little harder to pick up sometimes. Like in the right colors, I think you can pull it off, but not every deck can do it.
Nope, I think pretty much only green-based decks can consistently be able to splash a third color. But I think there's so much good green fixing that sometimes you can even go 4 or 5 colors. But yeah, it's not like the other 2 Ravnica sets we just played where you could play 3 colors with your eyes closed, basically. It's hard to do that in this format. And I kind of like that, that's how most limited formats are, honestly. It's just that we've had back-to-back formats that weren't like that. So we kind of got trained, I think, to being like, yeah, I can play 3 colors, no problem. And that's just not the case in this format most of the time.
Oh, definitely. And I almost think there's a little bit of a crossover constructed as well, because right now we have probably one of the better mana bases for 3-color than we've had in a long time, thanks to the shock lands and the check lands being together. But yeah, the gates made everything just so easy. It was so easy to always run Esper or Mardu. Let's be honest, just anything black-white in RNA, or the gates deck, of course. Yeah, this format, you just definitely have to stick to your lane if you're going to do a more linear, like 2-color deck. I constantly find myself trying to go like Naya or something and just not picking up quite enough fixing, or even Esper in this format's not easy to pull off.
No, yeah, I mean, I don't know how many times I don't know if I've ever managed, and I've drafted the format. I think I'm like 26 drafts in at this point, and I don't know if I've ever managed to really have a good 3 or more color deck that wasn't green. It's hard to do. I mean, you have the multicolored Guild Gate, and then you have some bad fixing like Prismite, the 2-mana 2/1 that you can pay 2 and it adds mana of any color. There's Mana Geode, which is decent. So if you're like really desperate, you can definitely use it, but it's not going to be consistent unless you're green, where you have access to commons like New Horizons, which adds mana of any color, or Centaur Nurturer, the 3 mana and a green 2/4 that gains you 3 when it comes into play and taps for any color. And then at uncommon, you have the 1 generic and a green 2/1 that can tap for mana of any color, and it has hexproof if it's untapped. Green has sort of an embarrassment of riches and took it away. It's like it took it away from everybody else in a way. Like the other color pairs, just the other non-green color pairs just don't have fixing. So, but again, I think that's kind of a good thing. I think it makes decks sort of less boring in a way, because you can't just always splash like the amazing removal you took with your first pack or the bomb you took with your first pick and things like that.
Yeah, it's kind of ironic that, as they talk about unlimited resources, you've got your Prince and your Pauper formats. And I guess they probably wouldn't, or I'm pretty sure they didn't ever call either of the Ravnica, Guilds of Ravnica or Ravnica Allegiance Prince sets or anything, but it kind of just felt like greed sets, because it was like you just grabbed everything that you could get your little grubby hands on, especially on Arena and MTGO where you're doing leagues. It was so easy just to pick up every gate that you came across and things like that. And now this format, you can kind of still do that, but only, as I've found, if you're in like green black, especially green black. You can go green other colors, but I feel like green black is the actual base for it, because that's, black gives you the good removal to play a little bit of a controlling game, and then green gives you all your fixing, and then you even have 3 mana. Oh my gosh, I am terrible with names. I call it. I know my nickname for it. It's the Flightless Bophawk, because it doesn't have flying, but it's Vampire Nighthawk, and it's also Birds of Paradise.
Oh, Leyline Prowler. Yeah,
ding,
that's
ding,
right.
Ding.
Yeah.
There we go.
that does give black green access to one more card that adds mana of any color. Yeah.
And the death touching lifelinker, which
that
awesome.
card's ridiculous. Yeah, you could take away anything on that card. You could even take away both Death Touch and Lifelink. It'd be a good card. You could take away add 1 mana of any color, and it would be a good card. And it's so it's a pretty insane card. Yeah, I mean, it's great for making that mana base the greedy mana base can still exist, especially in green black. But yeah, that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
So how do you feel about I think both of us think that this format is very bomb heavy, maybe one of the more bomb heavy sets ever. When I did my set review, I gave out more A's than I've ever given out. And that's still true. I think there may even be more A's than I gave out in my set review. So how do you feel about that so far?
Definitely a little bit of mixed feelings. Like sometimes when you are that greedy deck, you still just get run over. I found that in some cases, green-white can just be incredibly aggressive, like just flatten you out. Like I mean, some of it's just, Magical Christmas Land. Like, as an example, I actually had somebody play the cats against me. They did turn 1 cat, turn 2 a Johnny's Pride Mate, turn 3 2 cats, turn 4 a Johnny. I kid
that's
you
Magical
not.
Christmas Land for sure.
Yeah, I died. I was dead. I think right on turn 4, I just immediately conceded, and I hadn't even played. I played 1 creature because I was playing the green black slow, more control-y deck, and I just hadn't hit just anything playable for turn 2, and I didn't want to go down to 5. So, there's definitely cases like that where those more linear decks can definitely still do fine. But I do find on average you are definitely rewarded for being a little greedier and going with a green base and then grabbing all the, especially card draw. I definitely undervalued card draw a little bit early, but now I'm finding that, as with almost all limited formats, adding blue helps a lot.
Yeah, I mean, like Tamio's Epiphany is like an insanely good. I think I underrated it in my set review. I mean, I thought it would be pretty good. I think a lot of times with cards like that, I sort of scale them back because I love them so much. I want to give them a higher grade, but then I end up underrating them. And Tamio's Epiphany is 3 generic and a blue, scry 4, draw 2 cards, which is really, and it's common, so it's very strong. Yeah, it helps you. It's a great card draw spell. And this format in general, I think, is, your example notwithstanding, in the occasional deck that just sort of curves out, has a bunch of easy proliferate going on, like the landfall proliferate creature, and then just run you over. Most of the time, games in this format go a long way, and then, things eventually sort of reach a stall, and you have to find a way out of that, which can be repeatable proliferate, evasive creatures, board sweepers, removal. So mostly, I think this format's slow, and it makes card draw like Tamio's Epiphany a lot better. But you're right. Sometimes, people can just run you over, and that does happen. Although I would say, so far in this format, again, I'm 26 drafts in or whatever, I haven't seen anybody really pull off a good version of the red-white aggro deck. So, which I don't know if that's just bad luck, but I haven't really been able to put one together, and I haven't been run over by one. I have, like you, been run over by green-white and also by red-black, and sometimes by even blue-green. It can be pretty aggressive, but red-white's really the only archetype that I haven't really seen a really effective version of yet.
Yeah, and I think that's because red-white's synergy is like a bit closer to heroic and battalion, which isn't the best when there's a set where it's go tall. Like almost every other deck goes tall, and you've got your little red-white aggressive creatures. They just get shut out so fast. I think some of the problem, too, is they weren't focused enough, like with the design, and maybe that's intentional. There's usually one archetype that seems to get left out in every set. And yeah, there's a few cards that are sort of heroic-y, but basically it's just an uncommon, the signpost uncommon, the red-white 2/2 with haste, who gets a counter and scries when you target it with something, and like Feather, which is a rare. Those are the only 2 cards that actually have that heroic thing going on.
And so there's not really enough of a reason to like risk playing aura. Well, there aren't any auras in this format, interestingly, the offensive ones anyway. But tricks and stuff, you have a few cards, maybe 2 cards that care about heroic, but there's not enough of a reason to really push in that direction. So mostly I think the deck, like you said, it ends up just being a really aggro-y deck with smaller creatures, with less proliferate than some of the other color pairs, and it's just not as good at closing out games. It has to win quickly or it can't win.
Exactly, and when there's planeswalkers just running all over the place, you're going to lose if you don't take out the planeswalkers and, your opponent gets that repeatable card value, which has always, made them scary. But how have you felt about a lot of the uncommon planeswalkers?
I think almost all the planeswalkers in the set are at least like solid. There's a few that I'm not huge fan of. I haven't really seen T.O. work out. I don't think he's worth it, but I think they're all pretty good. I like that they're there. I think it makes the format interesting. I do think it makes the games a lot more complicated than they would otherwise be, and probably a little slower just because there's more decisions involved in a game. Now, the uncommon walkers, at least they only have one ability, one loyalty ability, so your opponent or you don't have to choose which one, but having to decide when it's the right time to attack your opponent's planeswalker and when to attack your opponent, I think is like a kind of a big level up moment in this format, because sometimes, a lot of time it is right to attack a planeswalker, but sometimes it's wrong, especially if your opponent has like Aid the Fallen to get it back, or if the static ability on it just doesn't matter anymore and they don't have any more loyalty to do anything, and you're not, maybe they have a few cards with Proliferate, but you're not too worried about it getting to use its ability again, you can just start attacking your opponent. And I think sometimes I've seen people in this format be a little too focused on attacking a planeswalker, or sometimes not focused enough, and that is sort of a tricky thing that makes this format complicated. The fact that you're always going to be faced with that decision, every draft, because there's just so many planeswalkers.
Yeah, and that's also kind of an odd knock-on effect that playing Arena, like best of one ranked has, is you see way more decks than you normally would, even just compared to, let alone like at a table draft, where you're going to play 3 games against people that are definitely going to have different decks, but only a couple different decks. You're only going to face 2, and then Mitgo leagues, you're going to only play 3 rounds. But then on Arena, you're facing 6 or 7. 7 different decks. So
in best of one, yeah,
you're just going to come across.
It can be more than
so
7.
many.
It can be 9.
Oh yeah, because if you lose, yeah. It's just crazy the gauntlet that you have to run that one deck through, and I think that sometimes downplayed. Obviously you're still going to get that randomness on the leagues on Mitgo, but again, when you got to play 7 games, that definitely exposes you to how your strategy lines up, with a bunch of different types of decks, for sure.
Yeah, that's true. That is an advantage of Arena, certainly. You get to play test a lot more. I guess people who are detractors would say that you don't necessarily get to play as much with the cards because it's best of one if you're playing ranked, but I think you get to, I think seeing more is valuable.
Yeah, definitely. And even if you play best of 3, you still play 5 matches, right?
Or up to 8. But
okay, yeah.
Because you can go for you after 3 you're done after 3 losses. So but 5 is the max. So this format is obviously filled with bombs, and I think there are pros and cons to that. A lot of packs, it's going to be right to take the rare or the mythic because there's so many super powerful ones. And that can be really deflating sometimes. Like, there are times where you just draft a deck in this format and you're not somebody who gets those bombs, and you're playing against someone and you're in like a great position. I've had this happen to me yesterday on stream, basically. And you have your opponent down to like 5 and everything's looking great. And then they play like Oketra, and it's just like, oh, well, I can't really push through that the rest of the way. As soon as they play another creature, this game's basically over because they're going to get 2 creatures. Even if I kill Oketra's going to come back. So it can be deflating. So it's certainly a downside of this format, I think. It's that there's so many bombs, especially if you're playing on Arena and you're playing 7 matches, you're going to have games that are just lost on the spot when your opponent plays one of these all-powerful cards.
Yeah, and that's actually an interesting thing to talk about. Although I still very much think the gods are all really great. Have you had any really bad games with them? Because I picked up Ilharg for a game. I was a little greedy and I forced it into my blue-green deck. It worked out okay. Like, most of the time I was able to cast it when I ripped it, but I did not do that well because opponents just had enough removal. I would tuck Ilharg because, again, he's a 6/6 trample, with a basically an undying ability. It's kind of interesting that there's times when you just gotta been a god. Like, it almost seems like it should be just never something you want to do, but there are definitely cases where you can get far enough behind that you do not want to tuck gods, and I just found that interesting because, like, at least right when they're spoiled, you're like, oh my gosh, like, of course you would just keep doing that, but I'm sure there's plenty of people that think I sound dumb. Of course you gotta do that, but for me, it just took that one experience, and I was like, oh boy, it's definitely something to consider, at least during gameplay. I would still definitely pick Ilharg and maybe build around him a little harder than I did the first time. But yeah, just a couple of games where I definitely lost because I just tucked Ilharg without thinking about it too much. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that ability, while it is incredibly powerful, I think some people do overrate it. I think some people think of it as like almost like it's being put back in their hand, but you have to wait a couple turns and then it replaces a draw. So it's not really, you're not getting card advantage out of that happening. Now, the gods mostly are so powerful that them getting tucked, doesn't really matter because you get them back. But I would say Illarg, I think, he's still an amazing bomb, but I think he's the weakest of the 5, having played this format. And the gods who have entered the battlefield abilities, like Bontu and Ronus, the fact that they get tucked, you don't care near, like, that's great because you get to use their into the battlefield trigger again. But, I think on occasion, especially if you're behind, I've beaten people when they have played gods. It's not impossible to win, but you have to be able to win quickly because they're going to get it back. And so, yeah, sometimes if you keep tucking it, you can win the game off of that. Illarg's still great, but yeah, there probably are times where it's like, man, what I really need to draw in the next few turns isn't Illarg. Like, he's not going to help me here. And yeah, so sometimes that might be the right thing.
Yeah, and I might have gotten just very unlucky as well, because there was a couple times where I'd tuck him, and then I would draw 2 lands. And then it feels like, oh great, they're building out their board. I'm just going to play Illarg again. He's probably going to remove it. And that might be also just an issue with card advantage, which has definitely made me lean towards drafting blue more often in this set than, say, in Ravnica Allegiance, where you can get away with just playing a black-white deck. Not a ton of card draw, but just really solid removal and things like that. Doesn't seem to fare as well in this format where you've got Planeswalkers left and right giving people tons of card advantage, like, or at least there's a ton of looting in this set with the Erratic Visionary and Kazmina.
Yep.
I feel like that's the card selection is just excellent in blue.
Yeah, it definitely can be. And having card selection in a bomb-heavy format gets even better. All the scry, like Tamiya's Epiphany, gets better because if you have one of these bombs, you want to find it as quickly as possible. So, yeah, it's all pretty great.
That's actually what the deck I'm playing right now is based on that I drafted. I got the, oh boy, I am terrible with names. It is a white mythic that it costs white X, and you get that many 2/2s, and if you pay 10 or more, finale of something. Yeah, the white one.
Yep. Yeah.
I've got
angels.
That one.
Yeah.
And the rest of my deck is just like ramp and card selection and sorting. I've got a couple other planeswalkers, of course, but that card is just a bomb and a half. Man, when you pay that 12 mana, and there's just so many. I've got 2 of the Leyline Prowlers. I've got two of the Centaur Nurturers, and I've got I picked up just 2 of everything. I got 2 of Horizons, so I've got plenty of ramp for it. But green, black, blue, or all the Sultai cards just really help. And then you can splash, some kind of win condition like that, and it works out pretty good.
Yeah, I think, in terms of, like, if we're looking at archetypes, and we kind of are moving in that direction, I think black, green, we've already talked about it a lot, and how it's where you can splash the best and how you can play the most colors. I think it's great in part, to relate to the bomb conversation, because you can take an Illarg early. You get 3 new Horizons and a Paradise Druid and a Leyline Prowler, and you can play Illarg all of a sudden. When you have 3 new Horizons that add 2 mana of any color, like, you're in business basically. And you can't do that in most other color pairs, where you can't pick up the necessary fixing to suddenly be able to play your double colored bomb. And that's a huge advantage in black green. I think also black and green are just the 2 deepest colors in commons and uncommons. I think they just have the best of them. So that, coupled with their ability to play any bomb they can get, I think for me makes black green the sort of the top archetype in this format, at least in terms of most consistently high power level.
Yeah, I definitely agree there. It just has the best removal, and then that fixing just allows you to go in so many different directions. Like you said, this is kind of returning to a bit of a more classic draft environment. Although it is kind of a bit different than, say, M19. I feel like the fixing and some of the card quality in green-black wasn't quite as good in M19.
Oh, definitely not. I mean, I feel like it's been a while. I mean, I'd have to look at the list. Since green was like one of the better colors, it's had some struggles lately. So, yeah, I mean, but here I think it gets there. It has quality commons that fix, but it has a good removal spell and Band Together. It has a good card with Proliferate and, the 4-mana 4/4 Hulk that proliferates, the 2-mana 1/1 that can proliferate or put a counter on something. There's just commons on top of commons. Almost every green common or uncommon is something you feel pretty good about playing in your deck, not like something you don't want to begin with. And I think that's true largely of black as well, which does have a lot more really good removal at common. But both of them are just so strong, and it goes really well together when you can also just play any bomb you open, assuming you get the fixing, which is possible in green-black.
Definitely. Funny enough, I think if you started with Magic Arena, you probably haven't played a format where green-black was a super viable strategy, because Ixalan really wasn't that great for green-black either. Like, you could occasionally get there with like the jungle creeper decks, but for the most part, it was just Sailor of Means, treasure color fixing rather than your traditional mana dork green color fixing.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. I mean, green in general hasn't been anywhere close to the best color in a limited format in a while, and here I think it's at least close.
Yeah, or even just the color of staying open and, being able to splash things. It feels like it's definitely been a while since it's been even its own, because that's usually the slot it fills in limited. Right. I feel like it hasn't really lived up to that for the past few sets. So I guess it's good to see it return. Yeah. Although I gotta say, I really did enjoy Gates, so I'm gonna miss that quite a bit.
I mean, Gates were fun. I'm just, back-to-back sets like that, for me, it was just like, oh, cool, I can play 4 colors every time. Decks having more of an identity, I guess, is more interesting to me.
Yeah, so I guess we kind of knocked out archetypes, unless you wanted to make any other comments on that.
I mean, I think all of them are pretty great. I do think green white is green white and blue green are both really good at proliferating, but I think green white can go the craziest with it. Blue green does, of course, have the 2 3-mana creatures who can proliferate over and over and over again, and sometimes that can create crazy board states, especially if you get both of them. So I think that's sort of the next tier, which you'll notice are both also green based decks for me. But then, the amass decks I think are good too. Blue, black, red, black. They also have proliferate and stuff going on. I mean, I think all the color pairs are fairly viable. I would even believe red, white is. I just haven't witnessed it yet myself. But I do think black, green's my favorite, followed by green, white, and blue, green.
Yeah, I think red, white is just kind of the merfolk deck of this format, where if you get all the really great uncommons and rares that you need, and more than you probably can even get on an average basis, then it could probably come together to just be super fast and deadly. But yeah, just not seeing it very much.
You mean the Merfolk deck from Rivals of Ixalan as opposed to Triple Ixalan, right? Yeah. Because in Triple Ixalan it was crazy. So
yeah, it was actually pretty easy to put together in Triple Ixalan. But you want to go over some of the individual cards we've been talking about?
Yeah. So there's a few cards that Mike and I have exchanged messages about, talked a little bit about. Some of them we haven't, and we just wanted to talk about them and what our takes are on them. And we know we might not exactly have the same take, but we thought this would be interesting. And so one of the first ones that we wanted to talk about is Neoform. That's the blue and a green sorcery. You sacrifice a creature. You search your library for a card with a creature with converted mana cost 1 higher than that. Put it into play, and it gets a +1/+1 counter. It's sort of like a birthing pod effect. So how do you feel about that card, Mike?
So at first I was probably a little hyperbolic on this, and I eventually did walk it back with you a little bit. But I still think it's a really solid card in the Bant deck in particular. I think it definitely has to come together, and you need to have kind of a mix of the blue-white value deck and the green-white proliferate deck going on. Because I've found one of the hardest parts about green-white is making sure that you have counters to actually proliferate. Because when you're playing things like Bloom Hulk, it can be a little tough to make sure you've got a counter out to actually proliferate if you don't have a whole slew of planeswalkers or incubator
Druid, I think.
That's maybe the one from Ravnica.
It's something, the proliferate druid, let's say.
Yes. Pollen Blight Druid. Yeah, so if you don't pick up those, it's kind of hard to get counters out sometimes. And, if you've got great cards like Mowu, Mowu is just a total beating in this format in my experience so far.
Yeah, he can be for sure. The green, white, gold card obviously is like one of the best ways to just make sure your whole board has counters. 1 a green and a white instant, put a +1/+1 counter on all your creatures, gain a life for each of them. So yeah, I mean, you need to get some stuff, but then if you do, the proliferate can be pretty insane, especially the green-white signpost uncommon.
Yeah, and I've even found that kind of hard sometimes because it seems like in this format, black is kind of the go wide. As compared to white, where white's got a lot of, it's got plenty of low to the ground creatures, but it's kind of hard to pick up quite enough 2-drops early. Whereas black, you've got a lot of the viziers and things like that that'll create you a zombie army token, and then also leave behind a body that's can at least carry a counter or be sacrificed.
Yeah, that's true.
And that's why I tried to build Abzan before, but the mana was so bad I just got ran over. Anyways, so with Neoform, I feel like that kind of solves that problem to a certain extent. And, as we came down on it, it's probably just a good build around card, or it might be just an incidental card that just works amazing in your deck, which means it should get a low grade because, it's edge case for sure. It's also lost some value since the start of the format because I think early on, it was really easy to look at Kasmina's transmutation and be like, wow, that's a great removal card for blue. Turns out, not so great when there's 1/1 counters all over the place. So when people were playing it really early in the format, like in Sealed and things like that, I found Neoform was great because you could sacrifice, whatever got transmutated and, go search for a creature up higher on the curve and give it a counter, and then you're just off to the races, especially if you went 3-drop into Mowu. And I think that was part of my bias was I had a great deck where I had Mowu. I think I actually had 2 Mowus, so I could play Teo's Light Shield, drop a counter on something, Neoform that into a Mowu, and then proliferate the next turn, and then I was just, I had 2 massive creatures that I just dropped a bunch of counters on. For very little cost, and I got to tutor Mowu out and play something else on that turn a lot of times because it, was like turn 3 or 4. So, yeah,
that's pretty crazy. That does sound pretty insane. Yeah, I mean, I think I gave Neoform probably like a D in my set review. I thought it was the kind of card that you'd play sometimes, especially if it helped you hit one really specific card, like a bomb in this set or something like that. I do think it's a little bit better than that, but I still haven't really come around on wanting to play it very often. I have seen someone use it against me to search up like an Ilarg and things like that. Like if you have like a preponderance of like 6 drops or even just a couple of them, and then you also have 3 or 4 or 5 drops, and your 6 drops are bombs, I guess I can kind of see it. But for me, I think you have to end up in situations where you're getting around that card disadvantage like you're mentioning, like Kasmina's transmutation or a permanent that, puts a counter on something and it's otherwise an irrelevant body, or, a token that you can sacrifice. And I just don't think those things can happen quite consistently enough in this format for me to want to be playing Neoform. Like I haven't been able to get myself to put one in a deck yet. And most of the time when my opponent uses it, I feel pretty good about it. But I can see like in a deck that has like a lot of even Eternals, that has a lot of things that just make extra bodies that you can throw away to Neoform, like by sacrificing the creature that makes the token. Obviously, you don't want to sacrifice a token to Neoform. It won't really do anything because it looks at mana cost. But, you can sack the Eternal and move up the chain, like to Mowu, for example. And things like that sound pretty interesting to me. And obviously Neoform, because of its flexibility and what it does, again, it's sort of like Birthing Pod, a busted card. It is seeing play in other formats, and it's become part of Modern already at this point.
Oh, yeah.
But I don't think I want to play it in Limited ever. I mean, I shouldn't say ever. I think sometimes you can end up with a deck that has just the right number of, the right mana cost, and you want to search for some powerful card in your deck and cards that make extra bodies or help you get around card disadvantage, like the Light Shield that puts a counter on something and frequently is irrelevant after that. So I can see it working. I just think most of the time it doesn't. I can't fully get behind it and give it my seal of approval at this point.
Oh, totally. And honestly, I'm just going to be the LSV to your Marshall Sutcliffe here and just say it's a C minus.
There you go.
Half step higher than you on that one, because I think it's doesn't entirely hurt to pick it up sometimes if you can just get it as a late pick. And if you do happen to pick up something like Mowu or, Kefnet would be an incredible thing to tutor up out of your deck. Just any of those cards that we're going to like slam the door on your opponent, but you might not. And, there's some times where you just never see them. But turns out if you have, 5 or 6 3-drops in your deck and your bomb is on is a 4-drop, Neoform gets you there. And then especially with cards like the Gods where they just can't do anything about it, I think there's play patterns like that, as well as just the more standard ones where it's, getting rid of a body that's useless at this point or has been transmutated, that kind of thing. I do think, thanks to the fact that there's no Luminous Bonds, if there was a Luminous Bonds in this set, I think it would be way more valuable because you'd run into so many more situations where it's worth getting rid of that useless body that's on the board.
Yeah, if there were common aura-based removal spells, which there aren't because it would have just nerfed a mass, other than Kasmina's Transmutation, which doesn't nerf a mass, so it sort of works out. It would be better, but in this set, there's not much of it, so it definitely takes a hit because frequently you're not going to want to sacrifice. You're just going to have it in too many situations where you're not going to want to sacrifice anything. And the more narrow a window is where a card is actually useful, the less you want that card in your deck generally. And I think Neoform, unfortunately, falls into that a little too much.
I think we could probably save our discussion on maybe some of the better commons in each color. We could do that next episode, but for now, can you sell me on Ugin's Conjurant? Because I'm still on the fence on that one.
I think I can. So that's another one in my set review. I gave it a C+. And that was a card that in my set review and in some draft videos I've done since then, people have said that card is terrible. I can't believe you would ever play it. I can't believe you picked it when you did. I can't believe you gave it a C+, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I would say that I think people are overlooking some of the value here. I mean, so the thing about Ugin's Conjurant, right? It's the X spell. It's colorless. It's not an artifact. It's colorless. It comes into play with X +1/+1 counters. And then it has an ability that is mostly a downside. It says when it takes damage, prevent that damage and remove that many counters. And it's a really interesting design, I think. I think it's a really cool uncommon. I mean, obviously, when we've seen cards in the past, like Endless One, which is just an Eldrazi that costs X, period, and puts counters on itself. Those cards are great because they scale with the game. They can be whatever you need them to be. In the later part of the game, they're going to be the biggest creature on the board. In the early part of the game, they can help you curve out. But obviously, Endless One, for example, doesn't come with that downside, which is, again, mostly a downside. But I think Ugin's Conjurant, despite having that problem wherein, little creatures can slowly block it and bring it down to size and it can't attack anymore, I think the fact that it's still something that you can always play and have it be relevant, based on how much mana you have, plus the fact that we have Proliferate all over the place, which means you can get those counters back sometimes, plus the fact that there's some Death Touch at common and uncommon, the only time where this ability is upside instead of downside. I think all of that actually makes Ugin's Conjurant actually more like a B-. I've seen it really overperform in this format because you can play it again. It's always going to be what you need it to be, and it synergizes well with what this format has going on, especially all the Proliferate all over the place. But I think overall, you actually like the idea of taking it relatively early, especially because you're going to play it no matter what. We just talked about how fixing isn't great in this format. Ugin's Conjurant is a card of a reasonable power level that you always know you're going to play, and I think you always should play. If you open them in sealed, you should definitely always play them. It's really panned out that way in this format. And I think you should take them relatively early and maybe even pick one in some weak packs. Does that sell you on Ugin's Conjurant at all?
So let's go with a more concrete example here, because I've seen people say that they would take Ugin's Conjurant because it is an uncommon. Some people have said that they would take it over any common. So what makes this a better pick than, say, Obnic Soulless Cruelty?
It's not. I mean, I think I don't mean to oversell the card. It's not that good. Obnic Soulless Cruelty, Jaya's Greeting. I'm sure there are several other commons I would take over it. And there are lots of uncommons I would take over it. I wouldn't take it over premium removal basically ever. Cards that are really efficient removal spells that can deal with a wide variety of creatures. I wouldn't take it over it. Now, where I would probably take it, where it starts to get a little more interesting, is like Ugin's Conjurant versus Wanderer's Strike, where you're sort of in a gray area of where the spell has gotten to be sort of inefficient, but it does have proliferate. And I think there you have more of a debate, depending on which one you want. And I think I would probably even then come down on Wanderer's Strike in the end. If it's early in the draft, obviously later I'd take the Conjurant because I know I'm always going to play it. But I don't think it's like the best uncommon in the set or better than every common in the set. I just think it's way better than a lot of people are giving it credit for.
Okay. I think I just saw too many hot takes saying it was better than any common, so I'm a little more sold on a more lukewarm, it's just a good card. I do admit I thought it was a little closer to being bad. Like, not, unplayable or anything, but just something I probably wouldn't consider, early in a draft, even though it does keep you very open on colors. But I think now that I know the cards better and, looking at it from that perspective, I can see how it would be decent. I think I've just been a little spoiled by these colorless, pay X creatures, because in my period drafting, the only one that really ever stood out was Walking Ballista. And of course, that card is just bonkers broken. So you didn't play with Endless One? I did not. So yeah, I guess lacking that experience, it just felt like, oh, you're just paying on curve for a vanilla creature. But, like you said, with Proliferate in the set, I think I might have also just underrated Proliferate a little bit at the start of the format.
I definitely did too. I think basically every card with Proliferate is like a half a letter grade higher than I thought it would be, basically. Yeah. Yeah, and that also comes from me playing a lot of Standard, where Proliferate just isn't seeing much play. I don't think any play right now, if I'm honest. I can't think of a single Proliferate card that's broken into Standard just yet. There might be some edge case ones and like Super Friends decks and stuff, but honestly, the closest card to Proliferate that's being played in Standard is the Elder Spell, which isn't technically Proliferate, but it kind of has a similar effect of just dumping counters on Planeswalkers. Yeah, no, that's true. But talking about Ugin's Conjurant as just sort of being like an on-curve vanilla creature, that's sort of true. But the thing to remember is that it's not just an on-curve vanilla creature. It's a highly efficient on-curve vanilla creature. I mean, you don't get 4 mana 4/4s very often in Limited. And in some ways, it's kind of like a split card with all sorts of different possibilities because it changes as the game goes on. And I think that is a valuable thing to have, even with the, it shrinks if it gets damage done to it clause. So yeah, I'm glad you think it's better now. But yeah, those hot takes about it being the best, better than all the commons, I do think are taking it a little too far. Oh, one more edge case. There is a lot of Death Touch in this format. Yeah. For sure. And it gets silly against that. Yep. All right. Well, we're going to have plenty more episodes to talk about this format, and it's a pretty deep format. So I think we'll have plenty of interesting discussions, down the road. But I think let's head on over to what makes our podcast different here and talk about a moment from Magic's history.
Sit back and watch it burn.
Right on schedule.
All right, so that's the limited part of our podcast. Now we're going to move on to the recall part. And this is a segment where I read a story. In this case, it's sort of a series of stories from Magic's past. And, I read through it. Me and Mike talk about it, and we have a good time as we do so.
Hopefully you'll learn a few things, like especially if you're a newer player and you don't know much about Magic is an old game. It is 26 years old. This year?
Yeah, 26
this year. So there is so much like just history and things that can just give you a lot of perspective on the game, when you dive into it. And that's what we're hoping to do here and have a little bit of fun. But
for this first edition of Recall, I was sort of inspired by what's going on in the community right now. There's a lot of chaos and consternation surrounding the Magic Pro League. It's a recent innovation that was just introduced this year. It consists of 32 players who were essentially paid salaries by wizards who travel around and compete at Mythic Championships and also take place in weekly matches against one another on Arena on the Magic the Gathering Twitch channel. We're not going to go into depth here about what exactly is going on, but basically the issue at hand is there's not a lot of clarity about how one gets onto the Magic Pro League. There's not a lot of clarity about how, you make this your career, and people are upset about that right now. And so there are problems in professional Magic right now. And so I thought an interesting thing to do, which we're going to do today, is go back to a time before Wizards and the DCI ever really stepped in and started regulating the game. And we're going to see what the game was like before any of this sort of stuff happened. Well, as we'll see, there are some problems with Magic of 1993, which is basically the topic of this edition of Recall.
Yeah, you at home, submit your guesses now in the comments. Was it worse or better back in 1993?
Yeah, it's an opinion thing, certainly, but I do think, people will come down on one side or another more than others, but I don't want to give anything away. So eventually, though, sort of as foreshadowing, I guess, in January of 1994 is when Wizards creates the DCI to start regulating the game. But the game came out in August of 1993. So there was lots of time for the game to be played before any of that happened. Magic in its earliest days was completely degenerate. Sometimes you hear people who played back then refer to them as the Wild West days. And let's be clear, I think people often think I'm older than I am, thanks to my hairline, or let's be real, my lack of a hairline. I think some people think I was around playing Magic back then, but I was 5 in 1993, so you can do the math. So, I'm relying here on some sources that we'll have linked in the description below because I wasn't there.
Stick around Magic long enough, you'll hear about the glory days when you used to put the black lotuses right on the pavement on the playground and get them all scuffed up. And of course, everyone owned a black lotus back then, but they just lost them.
Yeah, that's what people will tell you. Yeah, everyone who played back then had a black lotus at some point. It might be true, but
it's still in my mom's attic somewhere, I swear.
Yeah, exactly. Wizards really never expected the game to take off as much as it did. I mean, how could they have? We're still talking about this game 26 years later. They didn't really imagine there would be expansions in the future. They thought it would be moderately successful, like maybe an indie sort of game today. They didn't think it was going to become what it's become, and they didn't really have any plans on stepping in and regulating the game in the early going. And people started playing tournaments because there were enough people who were interested. They weren't tournaments that were really regulated by Wizards in any way, but they did play them. For example, there was a player championship event at Gen Con in 1993. Eventually, Wizards does step in because the game got so degenerate. So what we're going to talk about is what was degenerate. To start with, when Magic first came out in 1993, the limit, or the minimum rather, for your deck was 40 cards. Today it's 60. It was 40 cards, which is still what it is in limited. So what does it make you think when you hear 40 cards for how big your deck is and constructed?
Makes it sound like about 10 mountains and 30 lightning bolts.
Yeah, well, you're kind of getting to the point here. Not only was your deck only 40 cards, which you might say, that's going to make the deck way more consistent. You didn't have a limit on how many cards you could put in your deck. There was no 4-card limit per card. You could put as many copies of any card as you wanted, like 30 lightning bolts and 10 mountains. Crazy thing is, as we'll see, a deck constructed that way, which sounds incredible by today's standards, wouldn't have been able to beat most of the decks that were at their best back in 1993.
Wow.
So in a world of the Power 9, those are the 9 most powerful cards in all of Magic, the 5 Moxes, Black Lotus, Ancestral Recall, Time Walk, Time Twister. Those today are considered the 9 most powerful cards, and they really were then too, but you could play as many copies of them as you wanted to. People would go to tournaments in these days, and the person who was sort of overseeing the tournament would take everyone's deck and look at it. And they would have to separate the tournament into 2 separate groups, because one group would be wins the game on turn 1 a significant portion of the time, and the other would be just a wacky deck that's, the kind of deck that someone might make if they didn't have access to all the copies of every card they ever wanted. And so they had to make sort of 2 tournaments at once because it wouldn't be fair otherwise.
I think you basically just described modern and standard right now, because there's currently a consistent turn 1 win modern deck, and standard is bonkers Planeswalker Super Friends decks that take forever to end the game.
There's definitely still sort of the haves and have-nots, I guess. Someone who goes to, they don't do this today, but if somebody went to a Friday Night Magic Modern tournament with their homebrew deck that, they've never even really looked at a deck list, it would probably be nice for them to be put into a separate tournament than against people playing their tier 1 nonsense. So
definitely.
You could see it happening today. So let's talk about some of the things one could do in this world where you could have as many copies of any cards as you want. Your deck was only 40 cards. So the most famous example of all of these is that of Channel and Fireball. And that's where, of course, the website and the pro team and the store for Magic the Gathering, one of them, gets its name. Because this was really the first 2-card instant win combo. So Channel is a sorcery that costs 2 green mana, and it lets you pay 1 life to add 1 mana to your mana pool for the rest of your turn, because, that's not busted or anything.
Not at all.
So if you combine this with an X damage spell like Fireball, that meant that with the assistance of fast mana, in other words, a Mox, the Power 9 in general, actually you need Black Lotus, not just a Mox, but you could still pull this off on turn 1. So decks could just run a ton of copies of both Channel and Fireball and some fast mana and pretty consistently do 20 on turn 1 or 2. And the game would just be over on the spot.
Jeez.
Because you could run that many copies of Mana Rocks, Channel, and Fireball that you could pretty consistently get those in your opening hand. So how does that sound like fun?
Not exactly. At least the current turn 1 kill modern deck has to really work for it. That sounds like, I got 10 Black Lotuses, 10 Mox Ambers, or not Amber, you know what I'm saying? And
I got you.
Channels and Fireballs, man, that must have been so consistent.
Oh, it was. I mean, and that's why it was a problem, because, that's the kind of decks, people who were really, really aware of the game and really wanted to win every game. That's the kind of deck they were building in this world of 40 cards and no limits. Another combo you could do involved Brain Geyser, which it's a little less well known of a combo, but it's still one worth noting because it could still win pretty consistently on turn 1. Brain Geyser is a sorcery that costs X and 2 blue, and it says target player draws X cards. Channel inherently sounds broken to us today. Brain Geyser, not so much. I mean, we see cards like this pretty frequently, and they're not that great. Yeah, I mean, but in a world where you could run as much of the Power 9 as you wanted, and as many Brain Geysers and fast mana, Soul Rings around too, by the way, even though it's not technically considered part of the Power 9. You could run all of that stuff. So what the plan would be with Brain Geyser is you would play a bunch of fast mana to get your mana up using things like Black Lotus and Moxen. Then you would use Time Twister over and over and over again, which is a 2 generic and a blue sorcery that shuffles your hand and your graveyard into your library, and you draw 7 brand new cards. So you could, get a couple Black Lotuses, sacrifice them, and then you would play, Time Twister, and you just keep doing that until you had enough mana to one-shot your opponent and make them draw their entire library with Brain Geyser. And since library is only 40 cards, it actually takes a little less time to get through all of that combo.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you think that Nexus of Fate sounds annoying, that sounds pretty devastating, but honestly probably kills faster than Nexus decks right now. So
yeah, it might really do that, unfortunately. Nexus of Fate, I guess, does give someone a little more of a window into what it might have been like to play against this today than maybe we would like.
Definitely.
So those are 2 sort of instant win combos that you could get if your deck was constructed in such a way, which, again, decks would be absurdly consistent in this world. In addition to this, there are some other sort of wacky things that you could do and mistakes that Wizards made, as we'll see, that they didn't know how to deal with because they weren't ready to step in and regulate the game yet. That also made things pretty silly. So one of them revolves around a card called Rook Egg. So Rook Egg came out in Arabian Nights, so it was in Magic's first expansion. It's 3 generic and a red for a 0/3. Today, we know that what it says is when it dies, you get to create a 4/4 bird creature token with flying. An interesting card, certainly not one we'd consider powerful. The problem was that Rook Egg, the way it was worded at the time, wasn't clear enough. It said simply, when Rook Egg is put into your graveyard. At the time, people decided to make decks that were made up of 60 Rook Eggs. And what you would do at the beginning of the game, you'd have your 7 cards, right? Then you draw your 8th card, pass your turn, and you'd get a free 4/4 bird every single turn.
Oh, geez.
Right, because people considered discarding it to be it going to the graveyard, and they aren't actually wrong based on the way the card is worded originally.
Yeah, so you just have a deck of 40 Rook Eggs and then just 4/4, 4/4. I guess you could just throw a Howling Mine in too. And then you're just like dumping 2 per turn or something. Man.
Right. And obviously, that couldn't stand up to a Channel Fireball or a Brain Geyser combo deck that just wins it right away. But it's another sort of thing that you could do that indicates how degenerate the game was when you don't have card limits and when cards have wordings that might otherwise be suspicious. And this card wasn't doing what it was intended. And so this, along with the Channel Fireball combo and Brain Geyser, these are all things that started to make Wizards say, wow, our game is way more degenerate than we thought it would be. Yeah. And there's one other example of a card that I want to talk about that, sort of further illustrates the need for a governing body to do something. And that card is Orcish Oriflamme. So today, we know that Orcish Oriflamme costs 3 generic and a red. And it says attacking creatures you control get +1/+0. So how good is that card today?
It's not terrible.
I mean, I don't know. I think it might be pretty terrible. We did actually just recently have it in a Masters set. In Limited, in like a go wide build around, it can be good, but like in Constructed,
oh no, you got so much better, so many better options.
Right. So the problem here isn't really the inherent power level of the card, or even the problem that you could run as many copies as you wanted to, like it is with Ruck Egg or Channel Fireball or Brain Geyser or any of these things, or the Power 9 more generally. Here the problem is basically that Wizards made a huge mistake. So in Alpha, they had at one point during playtesting, Orcish Oriflamme had cost 1 generic and a red. They decided to change it to 3 generic and a red, but that change didn't save, basically. And when the cards were printed, Orcish Oriflamme was printed in Alpha as only costing 1 generic and a red. But Wizards, realizing they made this mistake when Beta came out and when Unlimited came out, and these sets come out because literally they were printing the cards and the cards were selling so quickly that they had to print more sets of cards, basically. It's almost exactly the same set. There are some exceptions, but almost exactly Beta is the same set as Alpha. It's just the second printing. And when they did that, they fixed Orcish Oriflamme to be 3 generic and a red, which doesn't sound like a big problem, except that the way these early tournaments decided to deal with this inconsistency is by saying, if you own an Alpha copy, you can pay it for 1 generic and a red. It says it on the card. What can we do about that? But if you don't have an Alpha copy, you have to pay 3 generic and a red because that's what it says on the card.
Always use autosave, folks.
Yeah, it's certainly that would have helped here. And, still, at 1 generic and a red, it's certainly a better card, but it wouldn't be crazy today. But the problem was that people are complaining to people like Wizards about this game where they go and they're told, that their Orcish Oriflamme has to cost 4 and their opponent plays one on turn 2 and they have no idea how that's possible because they have one in their hand that costs 4. And this was just another thing that could create bad feelings about what was going on. A regulating body desperately needed to step in and fix the problems, which, as I said at the beginning of this discussion, that governing bodies may not always make decisions that we like. There's a lot of, again, controversy right now in the community, but you can see that the game was really messed up. And just imagine going and sitting down on the playground and you're just playing your wacky deck that tries to win with Hill Giants and your opponent just Channel Fireballs you in the face on turn 1.
Yeah, definitely not Magic as Richard Garfield intended. I mean, literally. Just some background, if you're a newer player, he never, ever imagined that when he made this game that people would go out and collect more than, a couple copies of a certain card. He just figured, people would open a couple booster packs, make a deck, have a good time. Oh, you just never can discount the competitive nature of gamers. We will find every way to break and bend every single rule and card to our will.
Yeah, and you can understand the mistake. It was the first card game like this. How could he have known? It definitely went a little sideways because they were so sort of hands-off about the rules. And it makes sense too. Like, to us today, it all sounds insane. Like, what? You can play as many copies as you want, but like, what are you going to do? Tell someone you own these cards, you physically have these cards, you can't play them, right? Like, that's, to us, it makes sense because that's how things are today. But imagine telling someone that in the olden days of 1993. You couldn't say something like that to someone and, not have them get really upset at you. And in fact, when they do introduce the restricted list and everything else, people did get upset because now they're being told what cards they own they're allowed to play and what cards they're not allowed to play. And when the limit of 4 cards comes into play. So it sounds silly to us today, but you can understand the mistakes they made at the time because regulating a game like this, why would you need to?
Yeah, and I actually feel like it explains a lot of current behavior when, you see everybody new to the game, ban Nexus of Fate, ban, this or that. They're just a little bit gun gun shy, I think, from even back in those days, because, not many of those designers are still around, but, I'm sure they got all the horror stories, like, people like Mark Rosewater who have been around since, pretty far back, and, definitely directly worked with people like Richard Garfield that were running that game in the early days. I'm sure they told them all the horror stories about, people that would probably came up to them and, got angry to their face probably, when they'd go to conventions and things. I'm sure there were plenty of, if people are the way they are online about these sort of things, you can imagine going to conventions and things like that. And, your fans probably weren't huge on not being able to play all their, 20 copies of Black Lotus or Channel, that they probably paid a lot of money to get a hold of back in those days.
Yeah, there's some crazy old articles you can find from like 1993 where you can buy Black Lotus for like $5, and that was a big deal. Like it was a big deal that it was worth that much. So it's kind of crazy to us today, obviously. But with 3 different printings of it around, Alpha, Beta, and Unlimited, Black Lotus, it was expensive, but not compared to today, I guess.
Well, even with inflation, you're still looking at, a card that you needed to get 10 to 20 of or something, whatever made your combo most degenerate. And, with inflation, $5 from the 90s is closer to like $12 now, I think.
Probably something like that, yeah.
So that's a really expensive card when you imagine nowadays when half your deck is fair lands, Although right now in Standard, lands are pretty pricey, but you know what I'm saying. You can build much cheaper decks nowadays for sure on scale.
Yep, but it was, I guess, a play-to-win game back in the early days if you really wanted to be winning on turn 1, which is what you kind of had to do if you wanted to be a winner in the early days. The olden Wild West days of 1993 in Magic the Gathering.
Yeah, I gotta say, I knew at least about the general topic here, but I didn't know about some of those decks. That just sounds degenerate. Hopefully in the video version I put up, I'll put up some of these cards so you can read them a little closer and, see what we're talking about here and get a, better sense for the history of the game. Like I said, if you're new to the game, you probably haven't seen these cards, or I'm sure you've heard some of the horror stories and you definitely know, what the Black Lotus is. Everyone, has heard of that through, cultural osmosis. But yeah, it gives me a lot of respect for them back in the day to pull the trigger on such a hard decision like that. That's not an easy thing to do. I'm sure it definitely ticked off a lot of people, considering how PR is nowadays with the internet and everything. Like, I just can't imagine how many people probably just quit the game outright when they heard about that. Or, at the same time, I'm sure kitchen table Magic was probably thriving more than ever back then. I'm sure local shops didn't give a crap about, whatever rules they handed down. So maybe it was a little easier to walk things in, over a few years. As things became more consolidated and tournaments started, like Pro Tours started popping up.
Indeed. Yeah. And next time, what we're going to talk about in this series, this part of our podcast called Recall, is we're going to talk about the creation of this governing body. And we're going to talk about the very first professional Magic tournament, if we want to call it that, the World Championships in 1994. And we're going to see that while they got a lot fixed, restricting things to 4 cards as they would and restricting the Power 9 to 1 card, among other things, there were still some things left that were pretty degenerate from our perspective that would play out at Worlds in 1994. And that's what we'll have as our topic for next time.
All right. Sounds awesome. And I can't wait. And hopefully you guys can either. Thanks for sticking with us through our first episode. I know there's probably some things that we can definitely work on, and we'd love to hear from you guys. You can always reach me on Twitter. I'm at Mythic Tales Mike, and you can check out my animations I put up. And occasionally I might upload to my YouTube channel. It's also Mythic Tales. How about you, Nitsuhone? Where can people find all your stuff?
On YouTube, you can find me at Nitsuhone Magic. On Twitter, you can find me at Nitsuhone Magic. On Twitch, you can find me at just Nitsuhone there. There's no magic. Probably should be a little more consistent, but no, it's just Nitsuhone on Twitch. And I post, if you're interested more in history videos, you'll find those on my YouTube channel, which you may be on right now. If you're more interested in drafts, you'll find those also on my YouTube channel. And that's also mostly what I stream is limited. So, but yeah, thanks for sticking around this time. This is definitely something of a pilot episode. We don't expect it to be perfect, unless it is, and then great. But otherwise, it's a pilot episode. So thanks for everyone for sticking around and listening. And we'll be back again next week with a new episode of Limited Recall.
Let's go out with a bang!